Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome here in Brussels for this afternoon session that will kick off around the Africa-Europe cooperation on peace, security, and defense. My name is Holly Ranaivozanany, and I'm the head of Outreach, Advocacy, and Partnerships for the Africa-Europe Foundation. So for those who don't know yet our organization, we are actually co-founded by Friends of Europe and the Mo Ibrahim Foundation in partnership with the One Campaign and the African Climate Foundation. And our mission is very much to advance the Africa-Europe relations and also through frank and honest dialogues, sometimes on contentious issues, and through catalyzing ideas and initiatives for a renewed partnership between the two continents. So I'm very delighted to be here today to kind of address this conversation today, because as we know, the African continent is home to 1.4 billion people, has been facing today for several years on multidimensional challenges. That includes violent extremism, which has definitely become the main security issue, with its share of civilian victims, and of course its impact as well on the development of countries that have been affected by this. But we've seen as well the resurgence of unconstitutional political changes and also intra-African migration, which is often perceived as a source of conflict and fuels frequent struggles for land, resources, and jobs. And of course, this situation has been exacerbated as well by the lack of responsible and sustainable responses to develop the resilience of states and population to the impacts of these global crises. And of course, we can think here, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic, and has been followed as well with the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. We've seen also on the continent that multinational responses for the security crisis seem to be reaching their limits. So we've seen the withdrawal of the Operation Barkhane from Mali, for instance, the criticism of effectiveness on some UN missions, particularly MINUSMA and MINUSCO. So they are prompting actually reactions about refocusing on the promotion of different solutions. We know as well that security on the continent is above all a matter of the African states themselves, in their ability to, of course, ensure the physical protection of people, of also the property and that. But we've seen as well that recent crises have highlighted the vulnerability and dependence of African states. So today it's very much also discussing about strategic empowerment of the continent, what kind of strategic, global strategy for collective security that we need to discuss about. And I'd like to also mention about our latest high-level group of personality report that we actually released earlier in this month, where we actually convinced that there is a need of a strong Africa-Europe partnership that should be the most effective way to kind of resolve this interconnected crisis that we've been seeing around inflation, energy crisis, food security, and climate change, areas that, of course, are of concerns when we talk about social tensions, and that, of course, will generate instability on the continent. So today's conversation is really essential to really explore that role that international partnerships play in strengthening and promoting stability in Africa, while, of course, reinforcing its autonomy in the area of security. So I'm very delighted to actually welcome leaders and experts in this conversation today to share their insights with us, and of course to make this conversation as interactive as possible so that we have, of course, time for questions and answers today. So first of all, I would like to welcome online Ms. Elissa Jobson, who is the Chief of Advocacy at International Crisis Group. We also have David Korpela, who is here with me, who is the head of cabinet of the European Union Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. Welcome. We also have Dr. Carlos Lopes, Associate Fellow and Professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, former High Representative of the Commission of the African Union, and Chair of the African Climate Foundation Advisory Council and Chairman of the Board, which is our sister organization. Welcome as well to the conversation. And we'll have as well Alexander Stubb, Director of the School for Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, and former Prime Minister in Finland, joining us as well online. So I would like to start the conversation today with you, Mr. Stubb, as I understand that you would be actually leaving before 2 p.m. and very grateful for your time. I'd like to understand from your perspective, how can regional cooperation organizations such as the EU, the NATO, or the African Union could really serve as platforms for building and sustaining common responses to the continent's shared challenges? So over to you, Mr. Stubb.
Sure. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'll jump straight into the subject. And let me preface it like this. I think doesn't matter which continent you're from or which country you live in, we are currently faced with 4 global challenges or structural challenges that each of us have to deal with. And the 4 are, number 1, demography, number 2, climate, number 3, economy, and number 4, technology. So if we start from this basic premise that these are kind of collective goods or collective challenges, it's much easier to start looking at how we can deal with them on the different continents and different regional cooperation forms. So demography, for instance, in Africa, the elevator is completely the opposite to Europe. In other words, a population is increasing and the age or median age is decreasing. In Europe, it's the other way around. Hans Rosling, who's written the late Hans Rosling, who's written one of my favorite books called Factfulness, he talks about the PIN code of the world when it comes to demography. Right now, it is, roughly speaking, 1114, which means 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, 1 billion in America, and then 4 billion in Asia. By the end of the century, the code is going to be different. It's going to be 1145. And if this is an understanding from, say, the European continent about the demographic change in Africa, I think this will change a lot of minds. The second challenge is climate. Again, going to hit us asymmetrically. I'm sure Carlos is going to talk about COP27 because he was just there. But the bottom line is very simple. It's an existential crisis. It's an existential challenge which hits, say, Finland or South Africa, where Carlos is sitting at the moment, asymmetrically and in a different kind of way. Economy, the third one, of course, the general sort of necessity for every society, wherever you are, to not only survive, but to be able to allocate wealth. And then finally and fourth is technology, where I believe personally that artificial intelligence and robotization is going to change the economy and the way in which we work, politics and the way in which we communicate, and then science and the way in which we are as human beings. Now, if this is a starting premise, that we have these 4 challenges, demography,
I think we may have a technical challenge. Talking about technology. So I think, Mr. Stubb maybe can join us later. We check it. So I think he talked about indeed these different challenges, and climate is definitely has been highlighted. And maybe since we have Mr. Lopes online joining us, and Mr. Lopes, you just came back for COP27, and it would be great actually to hear from you if you think the security issue is still big on the agenda at COP, and what do you think in terms of, again, international cooperation that still needs to be discussed. And that is also linked with the latest AU-EU summit that happened in February back in 2022. Any comments, any thoughts that you would like to share with us on that? Over to you, Mr. Lopes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really can say safely that we have witnessed over the last few centuries a trajectory of growth and a trajectory of development that has provoked a lot of goods, but also 2 big problems. One problem is the fact that the emissions associated with the model and the systems of production that propelled this type of growth and development cannot be sustained. We have damaged the planet, and we cannot pursue in the same course. The second problem is that it has been geared towards wealth accumulation. Although a lot of people have been uplifted from poverty, the levels of accumulation and asymmetry have exacerbated some of the problems that we are facing today. And they are interlinked, these two challenges, because the way we are dealing with innovation, research, it's basically provoking accumulation of rights and accumulation of wealth by a few. And this is becoming more and more skewed, and the planet will not be able to be sustained if we don't change course. And this comes with a lot of security challenges. Let's take the example of energy. We can have a discussion about energy security, but if we don't associate to that discussion energy access, we will be missing precisely the point about those who have not benefited from growth. If we accept that 600 million Africans need to access electricity, for example, we'll have to look into why this is not happening, despite the fact that it would cost less than $30 billion to make that possibility a reality. And it's not happening because of the models that we have in place. Models that continue to insist on aid type of solutions for some of the problems that we have. And we have seen with climate financing, this is not really working. Whereas what we need is probably to tackle the systemic reasons why we evaluate risk the way we do. The most threatening risk that we have in the future is climate change. This is the reason why a lot of the conflicts that we are seeing either emerging or becoming more radical in parts of Africa and other regions of the world, becoming interlinked with environmental dimensions and particularly climate change. So if we consider this is the major threat, this is the threat that concerns us all, as Alexander was just framing, then we need to have a system change that is going to allow us to tackle this as a priority. And that means that we need to change the financial global system in such a way that the capitals that are required for us to move from fossil fuels into renewables are going to be available because of regulation, because of impediments of trade, and others that we have to put in place that are going to create those incentives. Right now, this is not what is happening. What is happening is that we have a lot of talk about climate change. We have lots of negotiations that actually often concentrate on money, but then there is overpromising and under-delivery. And yet we are not touching the core, which is how can we justify that we consider risk investing in renewables? That's why the investors are always asking for de-risking, whereas the bankable projects or the bankable initiatives are locked up with fossil fuels and systems of consumption that we should indeed consider a risk, but are the ones who are getting the money. So we have to basically make the deeds work in such a way that the talk and the walk are consistent, and this is not the case as we are seeing right now. The consequences in terms of security are enormous, and probably in this panel we'll have an opportunity to discuss further.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lopes. And when you mention about climate and economy, and that makes me kind of think back of what actually Mr. Stubb mentioned earlier on as being the biggest challenges already in all time. So maybe, Mr. Stubb, if I can bring you back there to kind of detail a little bit these challenges that you mentioned and how we could actually address them, maybe through a better cooperation and a collaboration as well across the two continents specifically.
Sure. Sorry about this. We're having a slight Wi-Fi problem. It's very rare here in Florence that it's raining, but when we have rain, there's a problem. Very briefly, I think we kind of need. I make two observations, and this is linked to a book that I'm working on, which is the working title of Order in a World of Disorder. I think we have a new world order emerging. The Cold War was very simple. It was bipolar. The post-Cold War was simple too. It was unipolar until it became multipolar. We have to understand in the West that we do not anymore live in a world where everyone will adapt to our norms and rules as stated in various multilateral institutions. So my observation number one is that the West, especially the European Union, needs to adapt something that I have called dignified foreign policy, which basically means more dialogue, less monologue, more cooperation, less arrogance. If we're able to do this with the African Union, if we're able to do this with a lot of countries, organizations in Asia or in Latin America, I think our voices will be much better heard. My first observation. The second observation is, I think what we're going to see now, coming out of a multipolar world which is becoming kind of, polycentric, that you have different types of forms of cooperation without the West. So you have the BRICS, so you have the BRI, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be the regionalization of globalization. And that means to me that the European Union needs to find modes and ways and institutional structures to work with both the African Union, but also regional organizations, ECOWAS and others, inside the African continent. So that would be my approach. Number one, be more humble in what you do to establish strong institutional links. If we don't do that, the Western liberal order is going to disappear.
Thanks very much, Mr. Stubb, for your comments. Maybe just to come back on what you mentioned around dignified foreign policy and also better, I would say, strong links with institutions. Recently at the Dakar Peace Forum, African leaders call very specifically for seats at the UN Security Council. So is there any comment or thoughts that you would like to share based on this very specific ask that African leaders have on the table so far?
Sure, and this is where I love being an academic and a professor, because I have the freedom to say whatever I want, and I'm not going to be in the front pages of newspapers tomorrow morning with what I'm going to say. I think in order for the UN to survive on a macro level, it's doing very well with its agencies around the world, there's no question about that. But on a macro level, the Security Council must be reformed. It is beyond the understanding of anyone who studies international relations of why the current composition is Russia, China, the United States, the UK, and Britain. We can understand it from the perspective of World War II and then the change that took place in the 1970s, but other than that, it is implausible. I would like to see, and here is where I know I'm unrealistic and a little bit provocative, I think we should have regional representation in the Security Council of the United Nations. And I will just mention a few. North America, Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and perhaps Eurasia. There might be a few others, but I think we need to I know it's the United Nations, but the United Nations can be represented by the United Regions. But of course, this will then entail regional integration to a greater extent all around the world. I know the comment is completely unrealistic, but this is my take.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. And I'd like to bring you back here, Mr. Lopes, as we're talking about multilateralism. And I want to come back as well to the previous conversation at the EU Summit, when we clearly mentioned that security and stability are at the core of development capacity. So from your perspective, what do you think needs to be achieved to make sure that actually we have these shared challenges, but how to make sure that we have a shared and common responses as well to these challenges? So you talked upon climate change, but what about as well the rise of violent extremism that you see? What about as well food security that will see rising issues, energy crisis that you talked upon this? So would love to hear your thoughts on that, Mr. Lopes.
Well, in the preparations for the summit, the African Union heads of state have identified 4 areas that they consider priority for a continent-to-continent engagement. And those were trade, climate change, peace and security, and migration. It is pretty well known that the engagements of the African countries with Europe are vast and complex, and the geographies of Africa are dealt with by Europe in different waves. And this has created a bit of a problem in terms of fragmenting the African voice. What the summit was supposed to produce was a very clear recognition that you need to engage at a continent level for a certain number of areas, and we proposed those. The African Union had this deliberation done twice, and Europe had no real issues in principle, but wanted to add youth, technologies, and other dimensions, which is fine. But the bottom line still is that the continent-to-continent engagement needs to be mutually accountable. It should not be based on the principle of aid, although aid can be part of the equation. It should be based on the principle of partnership of equals, which has normally been used as a slogan, but is not translated into practice. We have lots of examples that demonstrate that in terms of security, for instance, Africa and Europe have in the past collaborated strongly in issues like Somalia, but have diverged also on others like Libya. And what we know was the instrument Africa Peace and Security Architecture Preferred, which was an engagement where the decisions about security interventions or support from Europe were discussed at the level of the African Union and with the African Union, is now being eroded with unilateral decisions on the part of Europe. And that has created a bit of mistrust. And that mistrust is never expressed publicly, but I'm an academic, so like Alexander, I can be very blunt and say that the feeling is that some of the key sensitive issues, such as terrorism, are not being dealt with the level of collaboration that is required, particularly in terms of intelligence, because the intelligence is now being used as a mechanism to sort of score points between competing external actors. And in this equation, it's not just restricted to Europe. You have other players. You have Turkey, you have China, you have the Middle East countries, you have certainly Russia. You have a number of other players that make Europeans a bit more scary of sharing intelligence, but the consequences are that the levels of mistrust are just increasing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopes, for this. And indeed, there is, if you mentioned there is a mistrust, but we think as well that this AU-EU partnership needs to be even more strengthened. So I think we have a bit of time for the audience here to engage. Is there any questions that you would have at this stage from the audience? So if we have a mic, please, over there. So if you could just introduce yourself and then keep the question brief. Thank you.
I'm going to read this.
Thank you. Patrick Worms from the Nairobi-based World Agroforestry Center. It seems pretty obvious that across Africa, about 80% of the trouble, the insecurity, the civil war-like situations are happening in the most degraded parts of the continent. Yet, while we talk a lot about climate change, we do not talk about land degradation and the governance issues that lead to land degradation. These governance issues are endogenous. They're not governance issues that come from the outside for the most part, but they are the way that formal legal constructs collide with and interact with customary legal constructs for the management of landscapes. Demography was mentioned by Mr. Stubb. Of course, the rising number of pastoralists and farmers makes it more difficult to equitably share those resources. But that seems, from our research, to be the foundational issue that you need to deal with if you want to stabilize security across the African continent. The terrorism, the jihadism, all of those things are symptoms rather than causes of what's going on there. And I'd like to see the panel react to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe Mr. Stubb, would you like to react first?
Was there a question in there?
Reactions about the over-challenges that you would see relate to, for instance, the land in issues, all these indigenous issues that we have as well, in addition to what has been discussed around climate, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a very legitimate comment, a very good question, but I don't think my competence is broad enough to give you an answer to that. So I'd probably like to hear the views of the other panelists instead. Sorry for being so blunt. I can do this now that I'm not in politics.
No problem. Actually, I think that would be great for you, David, if you would like to have a comment as well here, looking at the Horn of Africa and your expertise to that specific question. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. First of all, it is a great question. It's great to have the academics who can weigh in and then dodge questions. When you're working for the EU, you have to respond to all of them. You're right. We see a lot of kind of failures of governance trying to address what is a huge climate crisis that is affecting the Horn disproportionately. Yes, emissions have come from elsewhere. What is it, 4%, under 4% come from Africa as a continent, and yet the impact is double in the Horn. We spoke to the Somali president, Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, three months ago, and he says, how am I going to tell my population that 90% of you can no longer rely on pastoralism? So the penny is dropping among African leaders who are all struggling now to sell to their populations, how do you change ways of living that have existed for centuries? Somalis love their camels and their goats, and the Dinka, their cows. How do you move beyond that? And I think this is the big dichotomy that African leaders are trying to address and are looking to the European Union and other partners for support and for answers. There are no easy ones. We start to look regionally and say, well, okay, where can we grow food in the Horn? Some studies say in Somalia, 90% of the area is not going to be inhabitable in the next 20 years. Where are people going to move? It's going to be a problem for Kenya, for Ethiopia, and yet you have South Sudan that is in conflict, where only 4% of the arable land is actually used. So again, we come to the European models of collective security, collective responses to these, where you can no longer look at Westphalian nation states having their own solutions to what is such a huge crisis that is breaking across the Horn. And I think that's part of where the solution lies, certainly in a community like the EU and others that have put aside some of our sovereignty, put aside some of our borders and this Westphalian sovereignty that, yes, this morning we heard we're fighting over. But on the other hand, to deal with these kinds of governance questions, climate questions, we need to find solutions that look regionally as opposed to just individually within those states. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David. Another question here as well. And please also mention to who you would like to redirect the question, please.
I think it works. Okay. Thank you, all the panelists. I am Colonel Çağrı, Turkish military attaché to Belgium and Luxembourg. And I have a common question to all the panelists, actually. To be honest, we were talking about all the data, artificial intelligence, and all other security investment like tanks, artillery, etc., etc. But you know, I just want to give you a simple example. I mean, for a normal European citizen, it takes 2 hours from Berlin to Rome, or from Paris to London, approximately, roughly. But as much as I know, and definitely I know basically, it takes 2 hours for usual African citizen to reach a potable water. So I think the understanding of the security between the two continents are quite different. So, and we are talking about the high technology weapons, blah, blah, something like that. And one simple question to panelists, I mean, do you think, can you tell me about something, how many nuclear submarines do you need to kill the terrorists? The answer is none. You don't need a nuclear submarine to kill the terrorists. So I think, of course, this is my opinion. So if the question is, if we invest the high-tech weapons, are you sure about to solve the problems with the new, that high-tech technologies, let's say tools, also to African Union or African countries? And so my second question is, I think all of us is agree that we should avoid a Pyrrhic victory, right? We should find a balance and ways and means anyhow. So could you say something about for the African security, it's the new ways of war or the new wars? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So related to investment of high tech, is there anything else that needs to happen as well in terms of collaboration and what are the needs for the African continent? Maybe something, Dr. Lopes, you would like to take on first?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I would like to say to our friend from Turkey that they have a definition of terrorism in Turkey. So terrorism is not an African issue. It's a global issue. And the way we have to deal with it is not very different in Africa from other parts of the world. When it comes to technology and when it comes to the use of technology. That's why you have drones, that we have a satellite, geolocation. That's why you can use weapons that are much more smarter. That's why you can use digital means like biometric identities to track the population, which are now accessible and were very difficult before. And we can go on with the list. So yes, we can use technology, but the bottom line is that this is a phenomenon that is not just the result of the apparent political dimensions. It has social dimensions, as it has been highlighted by the comment on land. But the point that I want really to make is that Africa has been on a colonial trap for the last 60 years since independence. And I'm not saying this from an ideological point of view. I'm saying this from an economic point of view. We were, during the colonial times, exporters of commodities without value addition. And today, 80%, according to UNCTAD, of Africa's exports are commodities without value addition. So we should ask ourselves what happened in the last 6 decades that has not produced structural transformation at the level that is commensurate with what happened in other regions of the world. And this is because of the systems of trade and the way Africa has been boxed in an interpretation of comparative advantage that is not favorable to the continent. So if we don't touch the essence of the problem, we are not going to create jobs, we are not going to have all these different issues that we are raising here solved. It's a very good point to say that pastoralists are not easily integrated in modern economies. But the point about structural transformation is that you sort of glorify informal and little and micro and everything else for Africa. And at the end of the day, you are not modernizing and formalizing economic transactions to such an extent that you can produce value chains and you can treat these different sectors from an economic perspective. We have done a lot on agriculture and land and primary sector, but it's always from a social perspective. It's to keep people above the water. It's not about transforming economically this potential, which is huge. So I think the discussion about Africa should shift from all these problems that we know, rather to the opportunities. You can't solve the climate without green hydrogen. 60% of it is going to be available mostly in Africa. You can't solve technological developments without strategic minerals that are highly concentrated in Africa. You can't solve the aging of the population of the world without taking into account the youthness of Africa. So we have to turn some of these challenges into opportunities. But we are not going to do it without addressing the asymmetries and without starting to consider that Africa is part of the solution, not part of the problem all the time.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lopes. And maybe I'd like to bring in here as well Miss Elissa Jobson to kind of comment, of course, on that question, and maybe tell a little bit more about the common responses and also the holistic approach that you have, especially at the International Crisis Group, to kind of deal with these type of issues. Over to you, Ms. Jobson.
Thanks, Holly. I think the question sort of illustrates some of the problems that we've had with the response to security issues in Africa, and there's been too much of a focus on a militarized response. As Carlos was saying, and I think as the first person in the audience noted, much of the insecurity, many of the conflicts and crises in Africa, at their base are governance issues. It's questions of inequality, of poverty, of a lack of services for citizens, no health service, no education. And as a result, you need a holistic approach. So European and African responses to the crises in the continent, especially those that are connected to terrorism and non-state actors, has been to focus on the military aspects of this. And I think that's something that we need to step away from. And it's something that we have been advocating for a long time at Crisis Group. We also think in terms of engaging with militants and with non-state armed actors, one of the key things is going to have to be sitting around the table with these actors. There is no military victory possible. The insurgents are too closely linked to communities. They can so easily slink back into the villages, and it's impossible, I think. And we've seen in many places around the world, not just in Africa, that it's very difficult to defeat non-state armed groups. So there is going to have to come a point when governments sit down and speak to the militants. In terms of common responses, I think we need to start with a common understanding of what security in Africa means. And I think the European perspective looks at African security too much from a European lens. It's not looking at what security means for African security means for European citizens. It's looking at what it means for what African security means for African citizens. It's more a case of looking at what it means for European citizens, and that's the wrong premise. And I think it means that it's very difficult for Europe and Africa to really find common responses. So as Alex said, it is going to require a sort of a rethinking and a reapproach from Europeans to look towards the continent to ensure that there can be a more common approach. I think also we need to create more platforms for engagement between the two continents. The college-to-college meetings, the EU summits are useful, but I think there needs to be engagement at all different levels to ensure that there is a more, again, sort of coming to a common understanding of what the security problems are in the continent. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jobson. So yes, indeed, when you mentioned about we need a common understanding of security in Africa by the Africans, I think that's very strong. When we look at the mission of your organization as well, it's very clear. It's about preventing wars and shape policies to build a more peaceful world. And of course, to build that and to prevent conflict and build resilient communities and societies, I think it's important as well that we address poverty, inequality, and strengthen the public institution and civil society. So is there any example that you would like to share with us well, or you within the organization you have built that and also strengthen that, that collaboration that is much needed?
Well, I think in terms of conflict prevention, what we're seeing actually is not a failure of early warning. You know, we know where the stress points are. We know when there's potentially going to be a conflict arising. What we're missing is early action, and that's action from governments, action from international partners, and also sort of concerted action at all three levels: the international, the national, and the local. So you know that's got to be something that the international community focuses on, responding more quickly to crises that we're seeing. I mean, I think one example I would give that where I think Crisis Group has sort of been sounding the alarm and helped contribute to. I mean, at Crisis Group, we would never claim that you know that we were the decisive factor in this. Has been in the last few years around elections in Kenya. I mean, I think one. You know, for 2 election cycles now, we've seen that elections have largely, especially compared to 2008 and 2007, gone off peacefully. But you know, this is because the international community has been, and also Kenyans themselves have been aware that this is a particular flashpoint. I mean, at Crisis Group, we're encouraging the African Union in particular to ensure that when it sent an observation mission, that it had someone leading that observation mission who had the credibility, who had and the power to be able to step into a role of mediation if necessary, but also to be able to bring together all the different observers and ensure that you know that the African Union was taking the lead, and you know working with civil society groups, human rights groups in Kenya to ensure that you know that they were monitoring the elections and trying to ensure that media was reporting responsibly. You know, it's all these types of connections, I think, which and trying to secure pledges from the main parties that they would resort to the courts rather than to the streets if they were not happy with the results, and sort of building communities and build within the country and outside the country to put that pressure on those leaders. I think those are the kinds of activities which can lead to real conflict prevention.
Thanks very much, Ms. Jobson. So you mentioned responding more quickly to crisis, and I would like to turn to you, Mr. Korpela. So we've seen you working on the Horn of Africa, and we know that this is a region that has been facing multiple and very complex challenges over the past few years, and notably in Ethiopia and the Cagri region. So we've seen the war that has been there for a couple of years already, but very recently there was a peace agreement that has been signed. So what we would like to hear from you is, we know that these are still early stages, of course, in terms of the peace implementation, but what would need to, in terms of continued effort in this kind of peace building, and what would be EU's role in that process, and how would you work with the different African partners, but as well institutional partners, to actually make it happen?
All right, thank you. I actually just returned from Nairobi on the weekend, where I was following quite closely the second round of peace negotiations after Pretoria, and then now in Nairobi, trying to finally resolve one of the biggest or the most significant, certainly from the Horn perspective, conflicts. Before we go into details on that, though, there's a couple comments I'd like to make on the previous speakers. The first, and my colleague from Turkey is absolutely right, that there is this dichotomy that Elissa also spoke about on hard security versus human security. I was at this morning session and, of course, saw the enthusiasm from ministries of defense around hardware, modernization, 5-year windows to now be a real player globally and project Europe. Part of me of course, understands that with what's happening in Europe is at war for the first time in 30 years. But at the same time, from the African perspective, if we simply transfer this enthusiasm to security cooperation with Africa, we've completely missed the point. Because when you speak to citizens across the continent, they are concerned about crime and healthcare and education, things that impact their lives. Yes, terrorism, but terror, even in Somalia, when you speak to a Somali, and I lived in Mogadishu for 2 years, it's a very real terrorist threat. But yet, the percentage of people that terrorism impacts on the continent is tiny compared to the everyday lives and struggles that people face. So if the EU continues to invest only in hard security, or think that our cooperation with Africa is based on weapons and guns and modernization and capabilities of armies, then where does that put us with a population whose security interests are completely on a different level? A population that is 70% under the age of 30, a population that in many places is rising up, and again, then you come to the whole history of the continent. Young people disillusioned with some of the old elite regimes that have existed since the colonial period. It's no kind of accident that Kenyatta was now kind of voted out. And if Kenyatta and the whole legacy of the Kenyatta family in Kenya, after 70 years of the colonial period, is still kind of a symptom of young people voting against and wanting a new president, new regimes. Sudan, it's happening. Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia is one of the symptoms of a president or a prime minister that comes in appealing to young people, sidelining the old regimes and old elites. And that then leads us into conflict between previous elites or previous ethnicities that were in power and new waves of something. Now, I just returned from the African Union Summit in Namibia, a high-level summit, and a lot of the African leaders are speaking about young people as a threat. All of these people are taking to the streets in Sudan, in Kenya. They're going to challenge us. How do we deal with this? And of course, Chinese are there saying, we can help you deal with this. The Gulf is there. We can help you deal with this. So what does security, and where does that place our security investments? We need to be very careful that are we, through hard security investments in Africa, just propping up old regimes that should be challenged and should be kind of replaced with something that's more participatory, that's more in line with European values. And again, all of you know European history very well. European history is all about popular uprisings and replacing monarchies and replacing old elite regimes. And if we stop that or do not allow that to happen in Africa by security investments and a security partnership that props up those regimes, we're in trouble. Now coming to Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is only one of several instances where you have these tensions. And again, it's a different type of conflict, where Africans, because of this troubled history of being proxies first to the colonial powers, and then in the Cold War being proxies, Africa is not going to have the military capabilities to compete in a militarized scenario. So of course they're terrified. They're scared of what the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine means for Africa. Will they be again drawn into taking sides between global powers or groups of global powers and having to sacrifice some of their own development interests and just becoming pawns in a game of global hard security, great power competition? It's a concern. On Ethiopia in particular, yes, there's a lot of hope in the region for a peaceful solution. But again, it's only the first of a series of conflicts between different ethnicities and the central governments. In Somalia, in Kenya, partly in Uganda, where this whole colonial history is still very much alive. Artificial borders, groups and communities trying to find a way to exist together within those borders. And it's problematic. Federalism in some ways is viewed as a kind of governance model for this. On the one side, we believe, and a lot of Europeans have solved this problem through federal systems, decentralized power, decision-making services to the local level so that they can solve their own problems. But yet you have other governance models. The Chinese model and the Russian model, the Gulf models are very top-down driven. There has to be a strong central state that provides and controls the countries. So you have this clash not only among generations, but also of different models that we're pushing and promoting on the continent. The lessons to take away from this peace process, and we've spoken about multilateralism. Multilateral institutions work with nation states in this Westphalian global world. A lot of the conflict in Africa is between the state and subnational entities, right? Addis and Tigray. How does a multilateral institution like the UN or the African Union, where your counterpart is the state, how do you mediate a conflict between the state and a minority that is not a sovereign state? There's already a skewed de facto bias, and this is why some of these peace negotiations were so delayed, led under the African Union. And ultimately, the solution was a panel, African Union plus some other heads of state, to bring some credibility so that both sides feel comfortable in the mediation and negotiation process. I think these are some of the things we're going to have to continue to deal with as we look forward at dealing with conflict. The asymmetry of state versus subnational entities, these questions of climate and of resources not being enough, and demographic pressures, etc. So maybe I'll stop there and hand over to you again. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Korpela. So you mentioned about security investment, and indeed, as what Mr. Lopes said before, we need to move from this kind of aid narrative to real investment, and still, indeed, we need funding. In the EU defense package, there is a shift as well, I think, in terms of wording, where the Africa peace facility is no longer on the table. That's been shifted into the European peace facility. So what is the message that you would like as well to address there? What does it signal? Because, of course, it raised concerns on the continent in terms of the investment capabilities so far.
Yeah, you put your finger on another very kind of sensitive issue, certainly from the perspective of the continent. The previous African peace facility was primarily for investments in collective peace and security missions. The African Union mission in Somalia was one of the main beneficiaries, but there was in Mali, West Africa, Southern Africa, etc. Now, partly we've shifted the focus. The European peace facility is able to buy weapons and able to have investments in hard security. So partly we are seeing this shift, and of course the shift that is, from my perspective, certainly concerning, to moving tools and making them more hard security focused. The other concern on the African side is that a lot of money has been taken out of the European peace facility and put towards supporting the operations in Ukraine. I think rightly so, but Africans say, well, what does that mean for us? Does that mean there's less money for conflicts that have existed well before this and will continue to exist after? And the simple answer is yes. Unless it's topped up and more money is put into this fund, then there is less money available for such operations. Now, the positive side of the coin is we are moving into a different kind of partnership. I think the model of investments and development money being poured into the continent is shifting towards a partnership. You mentioned already the EU-AU summit earlier this year. let's have a negotiation about how do we do things jointly, both bringing investments to the table. There are resources, there are capabilities in Africa. It's not just a one-way street of Europe paying for security in Africa or Europe paying for African Union interventions. And this, I think, is what the Americans are picking up on. There's an African Leaders Summit in December in Washington because they saw that Europe is starting to reframe its partnership with Africa towards having an open and honest dialogue. And the Americans want to follow suit because they're as well picking up the need to recalibrate and to reframe the way that we engage with the continent.
Thanks very much, Mr. Korpela. We still have just a couple of minutes left. Maybe can I bring the conversation back to the audience? There's maybe ladies first, and then we'll take your question over there. Thanks.
Thank you. You mentioned the presence of China in the continent, and my simple question is, China is doing a lot of investments in the continent, both in terms of infrastructure, development projects, and some people in this institution call this foreign interference, which from my perspective is not a foreign interference, but this is another discussion. How the EU is counteract this presence of China in the continent, and how they try to minimize the influence of China in the continent? Thank you.
The question is for Mr. Korpela. Yeah.
Again, a great question. The European relationship with China is different from the American relationship with China. And of course, China is one of several other investors that we are competing with. The Gulf, certainly in the last 5 years, 10 years, as the Trump administration came to the US, there was a lot less direction from Washington towards the Gulf. And the Gulf has come up with its own foreign policy and continues to act more and more independently from previous alliances and spheres of influence. So there are several actors in addition to the Chinese. I think the Chinese are making lots of investments in infrastructure. They had big bilateral deals with the Bashir regime in Sudan and the Tigrayan regime in Ethiopia, both of which were overthrown by some of these popular movements I was describing earlier. It raises a lot of questions of where are these Chinese investments now? They've now turned to the Paris Club to try to bail out the economies because they're not able to repay these debts. And of course, new leadership and new governments are saying, well, we don't want to respect these. These were made by regimes that are now out. So unless, and I think there's a lesson that China is taking away, unless you play within the International Monetary Fund, the IFI, international financial institutions, then you open yourself up to risk that has always existed on the continent. So we see a Chinese foreign policy that is less aggressive in major investments and trade-offs, and now starting to play more with the international financial system. Because, and to put it very bluntly, I think they've gotten their fingers burnt in a few of those investments. But this is going to continue, and as competition increases, people are scrambling to invest. During the whole COVID crisis, as global investments went down, FDI to Africa was the only one that was up. This is where the potential, the economic potential, as Asia slows, European growth has already been very slow and steady. This is where investors see potential. There's huge interest in the continent, especially the Horn that goes with the Red Sea, is the busiest maritime trading route globally. All the countries along the Red Sea are, of course, ports, infrastructure. 500 million people live inland, and they are slowly getting to a stage where they're starting to spend and the economies are growing. So yes, can we see it in that framework, a potential where there's lots of room for other investments than others, but Europe has to find its place. And that place is partly going to be molded by the politics of where are we investing, how are we investing, and how do we see security in the medium to long term.
Thanks very much, Mr. Korpela. Maybe one last question for the gentleman there that raised his hand before. So, because we're running out of time.
Yes, this question goes also to Mr. Korpela. You mentioned we should try, the EU should try to aim for partnerships that support local populations' claim for democratic values. But isn't that, first of all, a way of European interventionism into their state affairs that is highly criticized also by part of the population there? As far as I know, and I lived in some countries there, they don't want to do anything that comes from Europe, and they don't want to see European influence, and that European influence in their state affairs also fuels positions such as China that does not require for any other conditionality. So I would like to ask you how to shape our partnerships with Africa in a way that is not does not resonate with neocolonialism. Thank you.
David, maybe quickly, and maybe I would love as well Ms. Jobson to kind of react as well on that, because it links with common responses and common approach. Go ahead.
That's a great question. Again, because of the history and perceptions, it's a very sensitive issue. And again, I think I would go back to what Mr. Stubb said as well, is reducing the arrogance and going into dialogue and partnership. And this is a mindset for Europeans. We have to change the way that we perceive Africa, the way that we portray Africa. It's still very much, well, can they do anything? It's conflict, and is there anything there of interest? If we go in with that mindset, then of course the reaction is going to be exactly that. So first, how do we reframe our own thinking about the continent, see the potential, see the capacities, and engage in a genuine dialogue as opposed to one that still comes with solutions or comes to tell them what they need to do? It's a challenge. And I think it's a continuous challenge that we keep working on.
Thank you. Maybe Ms. Jobson, if I can come back to you on your questions, and maybe if you want to react to the speakers before on the questions, and also maybe to hear your final words about what this security cooperation would look like. You mentioned about international, local, regional kind of levels, and how does it work with these different international partners that we mentioned, and the influence on the continent specifically. Over to you.
So I think the thing we really need to remember is that Africa is 54 countries, each with very different governance, economic and social structures. Also, each with their own interests. And I think we have to consider that African states have agency, that they can choose their partners. I think it would be healthier for Africa if we could move away from framing things in terms of competition with China, or with between China and Europe, or China and the Gulf, for African resources, for African influence. It's that I think for Africa's benefit at least, that would be a much more healthy way to approach relationships with the continent. In terms of cooperation, I think there are various levels of where cooperation can take place. We've heard mention of the regional economic communities that Africa has, like ECOWAS and SADC. There's also the African Union. Finding the EU is well placed to engage with these institutions, and it does, and it has had a long and complicated but very fruitful engagement, I think, with the African Union. I think one of the issues that Europe has, and particularly the European Union has around cooperation, is that as an institution, is that it's that there are also a series of member states who have different interests sometimes from the institutions, and trying to marry those and make sure that they are aligned is going to be one of the challenges for the European Union. And I think it's also imperative for the European Union in particular to realize that who represents the European Union, who delivers the European Union's message is important. And the colonial history and colonial baggage is alive. It is an issue, and so thinking about who the messenger is for the EU is important, and will help, I think, ease cooperation as well.
Thanks very much, Ms. Jobson. And I think on that note, I would like to conclude the debate. So we don't have enough time to continue, but thanks very much for the questions and for the engagement. And I think Mr. Korpela will stay here so we can continue the conversation. Thanks, everyone.